So I'd like to thank the organising committee for the opportunity to speak today to this topic of personalised medicine for obesity. Is it possible, or is it simply a pipe dream? So to start with, I think we have to really define what we mean by personalised medicine. And considered broadly, personalised medicine is the tailoring of medical treatment to the individual characteristics of each individual patient. And this has broad implications across all aspects of health, both in terms of prediction, that is, being able to tell an individual what their likely risks of future disease are based on their underlying genetic background, their molecular composition and their environmental exposures. Being able to accurately detect and diagnose diseases early through the detection of early biomarkers. Tailoring therapy so that the right individual gets the right treatment at the right time, and then hopefully moving on to the possibility of prevention. That is, being able to inform people accurately about the lifestyles they need to live in terms of dietary and exercise habits to prevent future diseases. But a lot of the clinicians in the audience here might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, don't I already to some extent do this in my practice? And of course, to some extent, this is true. Nobody here would give or receive a blood transfusion without first knowing the blood type of the individual. When it comes to prescribing antibiotic therapy, we take into account antibiotic sensitivities and susceptibilities. Oncology is really leading the way, or the modern way, in terms of personalised medicine. For many types of cancers like leukemia, melanoma and breast cancers, targeted therapies exist that are targeted to the particular characteristics of the tumour. Now, I can't show an example of them all, so I've chosen to show you here an example of metastatic breast cancer. In today's world, we would never think of treating a woman with metastatic breast cancer without knowing the estrogen receptor status, progesterone receptor status, HER2 receptor status of that tumour, and including other markers, and then targeting the chemotherapy according to the patient. This is an example of modern personalised medicine. But unfortunately, when it comes to complex metabolic diseases like obesity and indeed type 2 diabetes, we're kind of falling short of the mark. Now, on your right is the obesity management algorithm, which I downloaded from the ANZOS website on Monday. And what this shows is the treatment algorithm for patients who have a BMI over 40 or a BMI between 30 and 40 with obesity-related comorbidities. And not meaning to be critical, but this is rather a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. It doesn't take into account individualised responses to the lifestyle modifications or the pharmacotherapies. And unfortunately, there's an assumption of progressive treatment failure requiring an escalation of therapy rather than thinking about an alternative therapy that may have been more successful in the individual patient. So why have we got this roadblock or this stumbling block when it comes to metabolic disease? And I think the answer to that comes from the fact that we've had some early lack of success when it comes to personalised medicine for obesity. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's start by looking at the genetics underpinning obesity. Now, we have had some successes in terms of the genome. We have been able to identify single gene defects that are responsible for monogenetic obesity. So this is obesity that occurs very early and severely in childhood. However, these diseases are incredibly rare, and therefore these discoveries aren't likely to be applicable to the broad population. However, they have been useful. They have helped us understand some of the underlying mechanisms of obesity, that the hypothalamus is very critical. They've told us that all these monogenetic diseases cause hyperphagia. And in some cases, personalised therapy has been possible. What is shown here is a child with leptin deficiency. On your left, you can see the child at age 3 before treatment. Treatment with recombinant leptin therapy, a personalised treatment approach, had a profound impact on this patient's body weight and obviously his future prospects for life and his future lifestyle. Similarly, just recently last year, a new therapy called setmelanotide, which is a melanocortin-4 receptor agonist, was identified as a potential treatment for POMC deficiency. Again, on this graph, you can see on your left the two patients with profound severe obesity because of this gene mutation. On your right are shown the graphs of these only two patients and their response to therapy. And what you can see is a profound drop in weight in only a few short weeks of treatment, as well as a profound suppression of their hyperphagia. So this gives us hope that there may be future therapies identified that are personalised to these monogenetic forms of obesity. But what about the broader obese population? When it comes to GWAS studies, a number of genes have been identified that seem to be predictive of adult body weight, and there's now been more than 150 of these genes identified. But very disappointingly, the combined contribution of all these variants only explains about 5% of the variability in adult body mass index. So if we take the FTO gene as an example, this accounts for one of the largest variants in BMI, and it's only 0.34%, which accounts for a difference of only 3 kilograms in body weight. Now, if you do some simple maths about this, what this means is that weight of 3 kilograms accumulated over a period of 20 years, it only equates to an excess caloric consumption of 525 kilocalories each year. So really, on a broad population level, knowing about these underlying genes isn't really going to be that helpful. But how about if we look at it in a different way? What about telling somebody about their genetic risk for obesity? Does that affect their response to treatment? So this graph is taken from the Food for Me trial. And in this trial, you can see the participants were randomised into 4 groups. In level 0, they were given generic weight loss advice. In levels 1, 2 and 3, they were given personalised weight loss based on their dietary habits, their physical activity. In level 2, they were given further advice based on their phenotype, their waist circumference and blood cholesterol. And in the 3rd group, they were also told about their underlying genetic risk for obesity. Now, what you can see from these graphs is that the people who received the personalised advice tended to do better in terms of weight loss. But if you told the person they also had an underlying genetic risk for obesity, it made no difference. They did not lose more weight between groups level 2 and level 3. What about having an underlying risk for obesity? Does that affect your ability to respond to treatments? So this is a meta-analysis, and for those of you who aren't familiar with this, individual trials are represented here by the horizontal blue lines. These were studies that involved different interventions: diet, exercise, pharmacotherapies. And what the investigators in this meta-analysis asked the question, does having an underlying risk allele for obesity, in this case the FTO gene, make it more difficult for you to respond to interventions for weight loss? And as you can see, all the blue lines cross 0, which means that there was absolutely no relationship between having an underlying genetic risk for obesity and being able to respond to a therapeutic strategy, whether that was diet and exercise, or pharmacotherapy. So if we drill into this in a little bit more detail again, does it matter what the intervention is? In other words, is there an interaction between the underlying gene risk and the treatment strategy that you choose? And this is taken from the Pounds Loss trial. Again, this is looking at people who carry the FTO risk allele. Now, what you can see on your left is that when the participants were assigned to a low-protein diet, whether you had a risk allele for the FTO gene or not made no difference. However, if you were assigned to the high-protein group and you carried an FTO risk allele, you actually did better on the high-protein diet in terms of losing more weight, suggesting that there is an interaction here between the underlying gene defect and the intervention. So these genetic studies are somewhat disappointing, but are they really surprising? I mean, when you think about it, the GWAS studies looked for associations between genes and static measures of body weight. And of course, it's not surprising that these genes then don't have an effect on dynamic measures of body weight loss, weight gain, or potentially weight loss maintenance. And maybe these are the GWAS studies that we need to be doing. When you think about telling somebody about the genetic risk for obesity, but not modifying the advice you give them, it's a little surprised that that has no impact on their ability to lose weight, whereas prescribing the more personalised diet had an effect. So turning from a different direction and thinking about the microbiome. So we know from studies in germ-free mice that the microbiome can influence body weight. However, translating what we've seen as research in rodent models into humans has been a little bit more difficult. We definitely know that the microbiome is important because early perturbations in the microbiome, such as antibiotic use in early life, do have long-lasting effects that translate into body weight differences in adulthood. We also know that lean and obese patients have different composition of their gut microflora and that interventions change your gut microbiome. Shown here is a surgical versus medical intervention. So again, in the panel on your left, you will see a number of slides. On the far left are those patients who underwent a laparoscopic sleeve gastrectomy and then underwent a very low-calorie diet on the right. You can see here the composition of the two main components of the gut microbiota, the Bacteroidetes and the Firmicutes. Now, what you can see is even though the participants in this trial lost the same amount of weight, because it was through a different mechanism, it had differential effects on their gut microbiome. And in fact, those who had the surgical intervention had a change in their gut microbiome towards a more lean phenotype, whereas those who were in the medical intervention arm did not. So the microbiome is a very interesting contributor to body weight, and it is an area that needs a lot of ongoing future research. What about pharmacotherapies for weight loss? Is it possible to predict who will respond to a particular pharmacotherapy? And is it possible to predict how much they will respond in terms of how much weight they will lose? And unfortunately, the simple answer to that question at the moment is no, we cannot. But we shouldn't give up hope because early weight loss after an intervention is the best predictor of future weight loss. And this occurs across every pharmacotherapy available for obesity and also includes diet and exercise intervention. Now, to show you what I mean by that, I'm going to use the example of liraglutide. So shown here are two graphs. In blue are the patients who are treated with liraglutide, and in brown are the patients who were treated with placebo. This was taken from the SCALE trials, with the top panels representing the SCALE obesity and pre-diabetes studies, and the bottom panels representing the SCALE diabetes trials. What you can see in the pie charts is that only 60 to 70% of individuals actually respond to liraglutide, when this is defined as weight loss of greater than 4% in the first 16 weeks of therapy. But if you were a responder, you are much more likely to go on to lose significant amounts of weight, with more responders losing more than 5%, more than 10%, and more than 15% body weight compared to non-responders. Fascinatingly, this also applied to the placebo arm. So could we do better in targeting our pharmacotherapies? What about pharmacogenomics and obesity therapies? And again, this is a very newly emerging field. And in fact, I could only find one study that looked at genetic variability in the GLP-1 receptor, the target for liraglutide, and response. And this was done in a very small cohort of women with polycystic ovary syndrome who were treated with liraglutide 1.2 milligrams for 3 months. And what they found is that they looked at 2 gene variants in the GLP-1 receptor. And the significant finding was that if you had the top polymorphism listed there and carried one of the T alleles, you were much more likely to be a non-responder to liraglutide therapy. So there is possible future hope that pharmacogenomics could help us in guiding pharmacotherapy, at least, for obesity. So what about diets? Can we personalise diets to optimise weight management? So in other words, can we integrate all the characteristics we know about an individual and plan the optimum diet for them for future health? And this is very exciting because I believe the answer to this is yes. I'd like to spend some time on this very groundbreaking study in which the investigators wanted to ask, could they modify the diet to reduce postprandial excursions in blood glucose, or spiky glucose, as Randy called it, in the individual. So in other words, could they study individuals, develop an algorithm, and then use that algorithm to then predict for people, never on that treatment before, that they would lower their postprandial blood glucose excursions? So how did they do this? They took 800 people and they put continuous glucose monitors on these 800 people for a week, and they allowed the people to choose meals, and they also gave them set meals. And not surprisingly, what they saw was between the individuals, there was a large variability in their glycemic responses, even to the same meal. They then took a lot of very, very detailed information about these subjects, their microbiome, blood tests, questionnaires about their physical activity, lifestyle patterns, sleep, their anthropometrics and food diaries, and integrated this into an algorithm. And using this algorithm, they were then able to predict the glycemic response to food in a cohort of 100 separate individuals. They then went on to use this algorithm to design personalised diets for a cohort of individuals, and they found that using these personalised diets, they were able to predict exactly how the glucose excursions would occur after meal, lowering spiky glucose in all these subjects and reducing their risk for future type 2 diabetes. So I think this tells us that there is hope for personalised medicine for diabetes, but it's not going to come from a single omics approach. What we're going to need to do is integrate genomic data with other data, including the proteome, metabolome, and microbiome. And we're lucky because we're living in an age where the cost of these investigations has come down dramatically. We're also able to gather large amounts of data quite easily from a large number of people using remote monitoring devices. This will, of course, raise its own challenges, data privacy being one of them, and also innovative analysis techniques to bring all this data together to integrate it into predictive algorithms. And it's not just me who thinks that personalised medicine is possible. This rather influential gentleman also believes that personalised therapy is possible for the future for diseases such as cancer and also complex metabolic diseases like diabetes and indeed obesity. And in fact, the future is now, because the NIH have actually already begun down this path with the All of Us study. So this is a remarkable project in which they are planning to characterise by deeply phenotyping and gathering data on 1 million or more Americans, with the hope that this can help guide precision therapy for metabolic diseases. Thanks for your attention.